All right, so
Okay,
you'd
so
like me to put your slides up on the
yes,
screen?
put the slides on the screen.
And
I'm going to show you what I'm
you have
talking
that
about.
great
Yes.
art background. So
Yes, this is how I always do it. They gave
there
me
we go.
2 years to develop these presentations first before I began writing. So here's kind of the fuse that leads up to the explosive appearance of Jesus. Here's what we're doing in this book. We're saying, hey, if you don't, I do a lot of no body murders, and that's where someone gets rid of the body and they claim this person ran off. Well, what do you do if you have no evidence in a crime scene? Well, you make the case from the fuse leading up to the explosive event and the fallout following. So here's Jesus standing in history, and there's a fuse burning up to the explosive appearance of Jesus. And if you look at that fuse, you'll see that the fuse involves 3 strands, which I describe in the book, and the fallout involves 5 areas of fallout. Now, all I'm going to do tonight with you is talk about the spiritual fallout. And so here's what because that's something you talk about a lot here when you're talking about Islam. So if you look at Jesus on the timeline of history, you have a fuse leading up to the appearance of Jesus and fallout that follows the appearance of Jesus. Now, there are a number of world religions that are on the fallout side of Jesus. And I've got them listed here. Now, I'm putting in New Age, but clearly that's not an organized world religion, but there is a view that's held by many millions of people across the globe. So here we have these 4 kind of theistic or spiritual worldviews, let's put it that way. Interestingly, you will find Jesus in every one of these. You will find Jesus mentioned because he's either mentioned, merged, or modified. In every one of these, on the pages of the Quran, as of course you know, on the Holy Scripture of Baha'u'llah, the Baha'i faith. So in all of these, even New Agers will mention Jesus in a very admirable way. Now, interestingly, though, there are some world religions, and let's just go back and show you those that precede Jesus. Here they are in the fuse. So these are ancient mythologies, and some of these are still active world religions that preceded Jesus. Interestingly, Jesus is also mentioned and merged and modified in these world religions, which makes no sense, right? Because they precede Jesus. But here's the thing. A lot of these extend into the Common Era. And as the worshipers were worshiping in the Common Era, they now began to change or include or modify their beliefs to include Jesus. So let me show you what I mean by that. So here's kind of the chronology of Jesus in time. Let's go to something quite ancient, Hinduism. That precedes Jesus, but it turns out that if you read the writings of Hindu leaders today, you'll find that they mention Jesus in a very favorable light. In fact, they even merge Jesus in, and they consider him to be part of their construct. They consider him to be divine. The world leaders in Hinduism will actually mention Jesus in a favorable way. For example, they will mention the details of Jesus's life. They not only consider him favorably, they merge and mention his detail. You could reconstruct part of the story of Jesus just from the teaching of the leaders of Hinduism. So, for example, if you were someplace where Hinduism dominates the landscape, well, it turns out that Jesus, you know something about Jesus just from your own Hindu leaders because he is embraced in some way. Now let's take a look at the second, Attis. No one's worshiping Attis anymore. But it's interesting that after Attis worshipers enter into the Common Era, they begin to modify their beliefs. And they begin to modify them in a way that sounds like Christianity. Never before. You won't find these descriptions of Attis prior to Jesus, but after Jesus, suddenly Attis, his body did not see corruption, just like Jesus. They somehow, now suddenly the Attis story includes a death and resurrection. This is not something that Jesus borrowed from Attis. This only occurs in Attis worship after Jesus. And for example, Heracles, very similar. Once Heracles is worshipped after Jesus, the worship of Heracles modifies. It changes. Suddenly he takes on the language, the titles of Jesus. He performs the miracles of Jesus. He sounds a lot more like Jesus than he did prior to Jesus. Well, why is that happening? Same is true for Krishna. As a matter of fact, if you look at how people worshipped Krishna prior to Jesus, it's very different. The titles given to Krishna prior to Jesus, very different. So again, you see this change occurring based on the influence of Christianity on other world religions. In fact, you'll see that people today who are like Hare Krishna will argue that Jesus is, in their minds, the perfect guru, someone who is sent by God. They even will give him the title of Son of God and Lord. So again, you see this happening. And by the way, they'll also repeat the details. So if you were to look at Hare Krishnas across the globe, you would learn something about Jesus from non-Christians because they are either modifying, mentioning, or merging Jesus in some way. So if you look at the Mithras, for example, often Mithras is offered as like, oh, the story of Jesus was stolen from Mithras. Well, really, study Mithras. Study the Mithraic religion, the mystery religion. You'll see that for the most part, there's nothing similar from Mithras to Jesus until you get post-Jesus. And suddenly the worshipers of Mithras are doing the same things that worshipers of Jesus do. So now, and Buddhism is the last ancient, okay, prior to Jesus. Buddhism existed prior to Christianity. And you'll see that even now, the religious leaders within Buddhism will argue that Jesus is within the Buddhist tradition in some way. He's an enlightened teacher. He is somebody who's on his way to Buddhahood, they'll say. Also, they'll mention the details related to Jesus's life. So if you are a Buddhist somewhere in the world and you're paying attention to today's Buddhist leaders, you know something about Jesus even though you're not in a Christian environment, because Buddhists repeat the story of Jesus. And now this is all of the people who precede Jesus. And I'm just doing this illustration so you can see that they're modifying, merging, or mentioning Jesus even today for those groups that still worship today. But now let's go to those who follow Jesus, like Islam. Well, I don't need to tell you about this because you already know that there's a role. Jesus is on the pages of the Quran and on the pages of Islamic scripture. And you'll see that he's merged in some way. He's considered in a way that is very similar to how he's considered in Christianity, or at least he's venerated in some way. So that if you are a Muslim somewhere in the world, you know something about Jesus, built on the true story of Jesus, in the way that Muslims have merged or modified or mentioned Jesus in their own scripture. Baha'i is the same way. Under Baha'i, Jesus is another manifestation of God, just as Baha'i. And as a matter of fact, all of this detail of the Gospels is mentioned by Baha'u'llah in the Holy Scriptures of the Baha'i faith. So you can get all of this information from Baha'is about Jesus. And of course, they merge him into their system. They accept him as another manifestation of God. So if you're somewhere in the world where Baha'i is worshipped, well, you know something about Jesus just from your Baha'i scripture and from your Baha'i leadership. And even like Ahmadi Muslims, well, of course, they think that Jesus actually visited, and here you get a lot of information that they mention many details about Jesus in their own scripture and from the mouths of their leaders, and they will merge Jesus into their system as a wise teacher. So if you're somewhere in the world where Ahmadi Muslims worship, you know something about Jesus just from your religious system. And finally, we'll go to New Age. So New Age believers are hard to kind of lock down, kind of like Buddhists and Hindus. There's not like an overarching set of principles I can refer to say, hey, this is what every Muslim, or what every Buddhist thinks, for example, or you can't really say that about Buddhists. You can't really say that about Hindus. You can't really say that about New Agers either. But what you will see is a veneration of Jesus. They have a tendency to think of Jesus in high regard, and they will merge Jesus in as an example of exemplary behavior, of worldview, all of this stuff as an excellent teacher. So if we're someplace where Islam, now here what I've done is I've just given you, this is the overlap. This is all of the systems overlap. So only a few countries on this map are not highlighted. So this is where people know something about Jesus, even though they aren't exposed to Jesus through Christianity. And what do they know? Well, this is the collective data you can get from non-Christian sources related to both the childhood, ministry, teaching, crucifixion, resurrection, disciples, return of Jesus, the titles of Jesus. All of this can be gleaned not from Christian scriptures, but from the worldview of other non-Christian sources. And what's interesting about these is all these folks seek to include Jesus in some way, while Jesus never returns the favor. He doesn't do that. In fact, he basically says, no, sorry, folks, I'm the only way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one's going to come to the Father except through me. So I'm just going to stop right there. That to me was interesting. I'll do one more step. If you look at the this is the fuse and the fallout of a typical murder case. You're looking at behaviors the suspect did before she goes missing, and then behaviors afterwards to see like what actually happened, even though you have no evidence in a crime scene. Well, even if you destroyed every New Testament, you would still know everything you need to know about Jesus just from the fuse and fallout of history. And that's what I'm trying to do in this book, right? To show that, hey, this dude, Jesus, this nobody, had more impact on, for example, literature than any other historical figure in the history of historical figures. And I can walk through all of these categories of literature. He had more impact, for example, on art than any other character. Any other, if you say, well, there's a fictional character that had this kind of impact on, who is it? No, there's no other historical figure who's had this impact on art. As a matter of fact, if you Google all the top artists in every genre of art, and that's what I did for a living, I will tell you that every single artist in every single genre throughout history, the top 3 artists, they've all painted, etched, sculpted, or drawn Jesus of Nazareth. No other historical figure can say that. The same is true for music. The history of music is so utterly dependent. And if you think, well, yeah, it's just Western music. No, actually, it turns out everything now is exported through the stupid glowing rectangles in our hands, okay, the phones. Everything is exported. This impact Jesus has on music is global. And the history of the instruments we play, the musical notation in which we read and write music, harmonies we use within music, all came out of a culture of singing that Jesus initiated. Wasn't initiated. The Jews had this culture. David wrote psalms. Jesus sang a hymn, probably a psalm of David, at the Lord's Supper. No one has been sung about more than Jesus of Nazareth, period. And all of our educational, if you think you know anything about upper education, the kinds of universities that we know today were founded by Christ followers who were raised up in a worldview that is a teaching worldview. Jesus said, tell you what, make disciples, teaching them everything I have taught you. He initiates a teaching culture. And as a matter of fact, all of the scientists in history who mattered, the scientists who founded the major scientific disciplines, for example, during the scientific revolution, sorry, they're not Muslim. They're Christian. There was a golden age of scientific discovery within Islam, but it was superseded and overwhelmed by the Christian worldview that is now responsible for more founders, fathers, and mothers of scientific disciplines than any other group, than all other groups combined. Not only that, you can reconstruct more about Jesus from science fathers than you can from church fathers. That's how much they wrote about Jesus. And finally, there's the thing we talked about tonight, which is world religions. No one has had this impact on world religions. So this is why I'm going to stop sharing this. Well, I'll let you stop sharing the screen. So this is why, David, I am so committed to this project, because I feel like we just have not been taught this in schools. For the most part, we don't hear about this, the impact of Jesus. We've forgotten that we're standing on the shoulders of Jesus of Nazareth and his followers. In all the things that mattered to me as an atheist, that was art, literature, music, education, science. Those things would not be as we know them today if not for Christians and not for the worldview inaugurated. The reason why we call the first century, there's nobody else who could have done this other than Jesus. And by the way, if there's no other fictional character that has had this kind of impact, it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is not a fictional character. And if there's no other mortal human who has had this kind of impact, then it's reasonable to infer that Jesus is not just a mortal human. He's had the only kind of impact, you can only describe it. If God entered into his own creation, I'm guessing he would have this kind of impact. And that's the kind of impact that Jesus had.